Hello, bonjour, buenos dias, bom dia. My name is Liliana Jubilut. I'm a professor at Universidade Católica de Santos, where I coordinate the De Mello Chair in partnership with the UNHCR. And I also have the pleasure of being the co-chair of the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network, GAME, with Professor James Milner. I would like to begin by welcoming over 120 registrants to this special webinar on the 75th anniversary of UNHCR, focused on challenges and opportunities. This is a joint event by GAME and LERRN, the local engagement refugee research network, and aims to create a space of dialogue in challenging times for international protection and an existential moment for the refugee regime in general. Before we begin, let me share some practicalities and etiquette. First, this webinar is supported by text translation. You can access translation through the links in the chat. There, you can pick the language in which you'd like to have the words of our speakers translated into. There might be a little delay. So just everybody can understand. Esse seminário tem tradução simultânea. O link para tradução está no chat. Este webinario tiene traducción y el enlace para acceder a la traducción está en el chat. James, do you want to give this information in French?
Oui, bien sûr. Tout le monde, le webinaire est un soutien de traduction. Veuillez trouver les instructions dans la boîte de chat. Comme ça, vous pouvez avoir accès au système de traduction de texte pour suivre le webinaire dans la langue de votre choix. Merci.
Thank you, James. Second, please note that this webinar is in the view-only format. Please use the Q&A function to pose questions, which we will curate and translate if needed, from Portuguese, Spanish, and French. Please be respectful in the posing of questions in the Q&A box. Inappropriate behavior or the use of hurtful or hateful language will lead to your removal from the webinar. Please be considerate of the moderators and the speakers and be respectful of the opinions of others. Third, if you have any technical issues during the webinar, please send us an email to learn@carleton.ca. This email will appear on the chat as well. Fourth, join the conversation on the platform formerly known as Twitter by tagging @learning and @refugeeseat on social media. This will also be appearing in chat for information. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the LERRN website in the coming weeks. Please visit the website to learn more. carleton.ca/learn. We hope you enjoyed this webinar and thank you for joining. To begin, it is my pleasure to invite Ruvendrini Menikdiwela, Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at UNHCR, to start us off. Ruven will talk about UNHCR's understanding of its mandate today and the challenges and opportunities in pursuing their mandate. Ruven, we really appreciate you taking the time on a very busy time with the GRF progress review underway to be here with us. We understand that you need to leave right after your intervention due to a commitment towards this end. So without further ado, we thank you so much for being with us today, and I give you the floor.
Liliana, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me, both you and James, to this webinar. And yes, I hate to start off with an apology, but unfortunately, I will have to leave almost as soon as I make my comments because unfortunately, it's really a brutal meeting schedule today. But anyway, it's really a huge privilege. And I see that we have some 68 people online, which I think is absolutely amazing. It really is a huge privilege to speak with all of you on UNHCR's mandate. And Liliana, as you said, it was exactly 7 years ago, almost to the day, that the international community established UNHCR. And our mandate was very clear then, and it remains equally clear today, to support states in providing international protection and in identifying durable solutions for those who are forced to flee their countries. Yet the context in which we fulfill it has changed dramatically. So displacement today is complex, protracted, and it intertwines with the critical challenges of our time: climate change, protracted conflicts, and urbanization, to name just a few. The resolution which founded UNHCR also mandated it to supervise the application of refugee law instruments. This enables UNHCR to issue authoritative legal guidance on how refugees' rights and states' obligations should be interpreted and applied. including to address modern challenges and changing patterns of displacement and persecution. Now, the obligation for states to cooperate with UNHCR in the exercise of its functions is explicitly mentioned in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, which is among the world's most widely ratified treaties. It is also anchored in regional frameworks and instruments, including the 1969 OAU Convention, the 1981 Cartagena Declaration, and the European Union's Common European Asylum System. Now, the UN General Assembly has clarified that UNHCR's mandate also extends to asylum seekers awaiting a decision on their claims, as well as returnees who have voluntarily gone back to their countries of origin, including under adverse circumstances, such as those that we now see returning to Syria and the DRC. The General Assembly has also expanded UNHCR's mandate to include stateless persons, enabling us to work on the identification, prevention, and reduction of statelessness, as well as the protection of stateless individuals. In addition, UNHCR will also be given the role to protect and provide humanitarian assistance to internally displaced people in certain circumstances. Now, UNHCR's complex, multifaceted mandate work across the globe can be categorized as resting on three core pillars. First, of course, non-negotiable, is international protection, delivering protection and life-saving assistance in all its forms to the millions of people forced to flee their countries. Second, seeking durable solutions. Since its creation, UNHCR has evolved to become a solutions-oriented, innovative agency, focusing on voluntary repatriation, local integration, and resettlement, while also embracing other pathways such as scholarships and labor visas that promote self-reliance and inclusion. Third, the importance of humanitarian principles and UNHCR's non-political nature. UNHCR operates based on humanitarian principles: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. These principles guide all our actions and ensure that our work remains non-political, rights-based, and community-centered. This often means pragmatism and adapting to a reality in which refugees frequently flee as part of mixed movements, alongside migrants who move for a wide variety of reasons. Refugees and migrants often face similar hardships and threats as part of their journey and are entitled to the same fundamental human rights that all people should enjoy. However, they are distinct in one crucial respect. Refugees require international protection since they cannot be returned to their countries of origin, where they face risks of persecution or serious harm, in regard to which the state is unwilling or unable to protect them. This all means that we work across the humanitarian and development divide and ensure that refugees are included in national systems of education, health, social protection, and have access to the local labor markets. This is essential to ensure that refugees not only enjoy their basic human rights, but are also equipped to contribute positively to the communities that receive them. It also means that international support needs to benefit refugees and hosting communities alike, since many of them find themselves in same situations of destitution and poverty. Fulfilling this mandate obviously is not without its challenges, and I will mention 5 of them. First, the scale of displacement. Today, more than 117 million people are forcibly displaced worldwide. This is a statistic with which we are all painfully familiar. Conflicts are more protracted and solutions are more elusive, often leading refugees and internally displaced people to be displaced multiple times. Second, the shrinking humanitarian space and politicization of asylum. Safe asylum spaces are shrinking, we all know that, and there are many voices online and in public spheres that are critical of the Refugee Convention and the asylum systems, questioning their relevance in light of current displacement challenges. In some contexts, refugees are portrayed as security threats. Protecting refugees in such an environment is extremely difficult and requires clear, strategic, persistent advocacy and principled engagement. Third, funding gaps. UNHCR, alongside many other humanitarian actors, has seen a major cut to its budget, with a 40% reduction in 2025 to its global budget compared to 2024. Severe funding shortfalls are forcing cuts to essential programs, leaving millions at risk. Approximately 1/3 of our workforce has been cut as well. But more importantly, crucial protection activities have had to be either halted or scaled back, including for the most vulnerable people in many emergency settings. For example, our budget for the Sudan situation, which has seen some 14 million people displaced and horrific violence perpetrated against millions of civilians, in over 2 years of devastating conflict is only 1/3 funded. We have also had to reduce our global GBV budgets by 38%, and our statelessness workforce has been decimated. Fourth, the complexity of displacement. People often face overlapping vulnerabilities, conflict, poverty, and climate shocks. Addressing these require integrated responses that go beyond just traditional humanitarian aid. And fifth, the climate crisis and other shocks. Refugees and displaced communities, as well as their hosts, are among the most exposed to extreme weather events, from devastating floods in South Sudan or Bangladesh to prolonged droughts in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. Further, economic crises, pandemics, and food insecurity create cascading risks that make displacement even more precarious. But even with these challenges, there are real opportunities, and we need to work together to make the most of them. The 2018 Global Refugee Compact offers a framework for burden and responsibility sharing, as we all know. At the 2 Global Refugee Fora and the midterm progress review coming up next month, commitments were and will be made by states, academics, cities, businesses, and the refugees themselves to do more to further refugee protection and solutions. Localization and partnerships are also other opportunities. Local authorities, civil society, and refugee-led organizations are at the forefront of solutions. By investing in their capacity, we strengthen resilience and sustainability. And then we also have innovation and technology, which are transforming our work. Digital tools are revolutionizing registration, cash assistance, and access to education and livelihoods. And then finally, solidarity and inclusion. When refugees are included in national systems and supported to become self-reliant, they contribute their skills and talents, creating benefits not just for themselves, but for the communities that welcome them. So UNHCR is working beyond emergency responses and building refugees' resilience from day one. That means working hand in hand with the host governments and communities, development actors, and making sure refugees can access public services and livelihoods as quickly as possible, not years down the line. It also means third country solutions, such as creating safe, legal pathways through resettlement, labor mobility scholarships, or family reunification. And to do all this well, we need good data. Reliable information helps us plan smarter, target resources where they're needed most, and advocate with confidence. Initiatives like the joint World Bank UNHCR Data Center on Forced Displacement are a typical illustration of this. When we partner with academia, we access the evidence base needed to underpin our work, especially in this era where misinformation and polarized narratives threaten the very institution of asylum. Rigorous research helps us advocate with credibility. Studies on displacement trends, integration outcomes, and the socioeconomic contributions of refugees allow us to counter myths and inform policy with facts rather than fear. For example, in Poland, a recent study undertaken by Deloitte showed that Ukrainian refugees contributed 2.7% of the Polish GDP. But beyond data, academic research and work also help us understand better the complexity of today's displacements, which, as I said previously, are not driven by a single factor, but are the result of intersecting crises. Universities and research centers bring multidisciplinary perspectives to help us design more holistic responses to these situations. For example, UNHCR partnered with the Consortium of International Agricultural Research Centers to use climate hazard data tailored to displacement contexts. This collaboration helps anticipate climate risks and informs strategic planning, including regional adaptation strategies such as the IGAD Climate Adaptation Strategy, which integrates human mobility and displacement into climate planning. Moreover, academia strengthens accountability and learning. Independent evaluations and peer-reviewed studies help us assess what works and what doesn't, ensuring that humanitarian responses evolve based on evidence. And most importantly, through their partnerships with UNHCR and others, universities have also developed new models for refugee inclusion through scholarship programs, recognition of qualifications, and research on labor mobility pathways, all of which are absolutely critical today. Initiatives like the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network, LERRN, and GAIN are expanding access to higher education for displaced students. turning education into a realistic, durable solution rather than remaining a distant dream. And finally, academics play a vital role in amplifying refugee voices. Participatory research approaches, such as those outlined in the Shifting Power Multi-Stakeholder Pledge, position refugees as co-creators of knowledge, ensuring that their perspectives shape both evidence and solutions. So as we move forward, we hope to deepen these collaborations through joint research agendas, data sharing platforms, and opportunities for refugee scholars to participate and to lead. To sum it all up, UNHCR's mandate remains as relevant today as it was when it was first established 75 years ago, to protect and find solutions for those forced to flee. But fulfilling that mandate requires adaptability, partnerships, and a shared commitment to humanity. The challenges are immense, but there are also opportunities, ones that we can seize more effectively by working together with states, international organizations, civil society, and crucially, people with lived experience of forced displacement and statelessness, whose leadership and voices are essential to addressing today's complex global humanitarian landscape and that of tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruven, for these insightful and very relevant remarks. I think we are off to a very positive and relevant and interesting start. So next, we'll be hearing from James Milner, who is Project Director of LERRN and Co-Chair of GAME. James will present some results of his research and assessment on the challenging geopolitical context in which UNHCR works. James, thank you for sharing these with us today. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Liliana. Obrigado. And wonderful to see so many colleagues with us on the screen and in the audience. Ruven provided a really compelling overview of the challenges and also the opportunities that UNHCR faces on the eve of its 75th birthday. And I want to echo the point that Ruven made that UNHCR's mandate and its relevance is clear and enduring. The point that I want to talk about is how the challenges that UNHCR faces as it prepares to turn 75 really clearly dominate discussions about the organization's future. And what I want to do is unpack those challenges and explain the sources of those challenges in the context of geopolitics. But if I were to summarize the challenges facing UNHCR as we understand them today, first and foremost is clearly the collapse in funding for the organization. Not just the suspension of U.S. funding, but what we've seen is a real decline in funding from traditional partners over time. So they're not just being something very episodic, but something that's evolved over time as we see a shift among NATO and G7 countries away from humanitarian and development funding towards defense spending. And that creates challenges not only for UNHCR, but for the humanitarian sector more generally. We've also seen rising political opposition to the foundational norms of the refugee regime itself. I think a very marked moment for this was a US-led event on the margins of the UN General Assembly's High-Level Week in September that called for an end to the asylum regime, not a cornerstone, not just of refugee protection, but of the human rights regime since 1948. And this event and this move was made all the more concerning, not only by the role of the United States for reasons that I'll explain, but also the participation in that event of a major refugee hosting country, Bangladesh, and Liberia, a country whose citizens benefited from the provisions of asylum during their protracted civil war during the 1990s. But a third drive behind the challenges facing the refugee regime and UNHCR as the core institution is the eroding confidence in multilateralism and the benefits of collective action more generally. And this is not just limited to the refugee regime, but something we see across the UN system more generally. This is a system that has prevented global cataclysmic conflict and promoted global prosperity, however unequal, over the past 80 years. And so it's no longer the case that we can simply point to the existence of these norms and call for them to be upheld. The case needs to be made more forcibly on the substantive value of collective action and cooperation in a world increasingly driven by power and self-interest. So while these seem like gloomy times, the argument that I want to make in the next 7 minutes or so is that a deeper understanding of the causes of these forces working against multilateralism, collective action, and the refugee regime, that if we understand what causes these forces and how they've evolved over time, we'll have a deeper understanding of what we can do about it. It's an importance of seeing the moment that we're facing right now within the broader historical context that brought this moment into being. So not that the regime as it is perfect. There are many elements that need to continue to adapt, as Reuven mentioned, as the causes of displacement become increasingly complex. But the history of the regime is one of adaptation and change in response to these shifting demands and geopolitical realities. So if we understand that history, I think there's more that we can do about it. So I want to talk about the geopolitics and the origins of the regime, geopolitics and the evolution of the regime, and shifting geopolitics in the regime today. Let's remember that geopolitics was alive and well when the refugee regime was brought into being 75 years ago. There were two very different competing visions of UNHCR that were debated during those days. One from the United States and its allies, who in the early days of the Cold War called for a refugee regime that was really reliant on states, that was non-political, and was temporary. There was a competing view at the time from India and Pakistan, who, having experienced partition and the displacement of some 10 million people in that context, wanted UNHCR to be permanent, to be strong, and to be independent from states. And it was the view of the United States that prevailed. So to really underscore the point that it was a conscious choice among states to give UNHCR the mandate that it received almost 75 years ago. For UNHCR to be reliant on the authority of the General Assembly, for UNHCR to be there to cooperate with governments as opposed to find solutions on its own, and critically, for funding to UNHCR to be voluntary. It's that reliance on voluntary funding that has been the major way that states have retained control over UNHCR. Think, for example, that up to December 2024, there was a policy that the United States would provide 30% of UNHCR's funding, 100% of that funding being earmarked. And this gave the United States significant control over UNHCR. Now, work by Beth Ferris and Susan Martin have problematized this notion of the United States as being a hegemon in the refugee regime, but U.S. funding decisions have played an outsized influence on the course of UNHCR's history, as witnessed most painfully earlier this year as U.S. cuts it instigated an existential crisis within the refugee regime. But geopolitics have also played an important role in explaining how the refugee regime has been able to evolve over time. That shifting politics have been at the core of UNHCR's existence and UNHCR's growth and change as an organization. If we consider the scale of growth, one of my favorite stories is to remember that at UNHCR's first ever Christmas party in 1951, the entire global staff of UNHCR, all 33 staff members, gathered around a single piano in Geneva as the High Commissioner himself played songs and everyone sang along. Today, UNHCR is a global organization that is really at the heart of a global humanitarian response regime. This growth of UNHCR, not only in terms of its size, but its mandate, has been driven by forces, for example, of decolonization and the growth of a global South majority in the UN General Assembly. And that rising global South view within the UN system is what has led to the General Assembly authorizing UNHCR to work outside of Europe, to provide material assistance, and to work with IDPs and other forms of forced migrants. So geopolitics has contributed to the evolution of UNHCR as an organization. Geopolitics has also enabled civil society to leverage solutions such as the response to Indo-Chinese refugees, the response to refugees in Central America. And geopolitics is present in understanding opportunities around norms such as the emerging norms of meaningful refugee participation, Geopolitics is at the heart of understanding how, the localization of research and work, for example, of the IDRC research chairs in 12 countries across the global south. Reuven, to your point, how the knowledge produced by those most affected by displacement can provide the evidence not only to improve programming, but really to shift the political narrative of where we are. So let me conclude by explaining how geopolitics affects our understanding of the refugee regime today. So Liliana, I'm in my last 2 minutes. For much of the regime since the end of the Cold War through to about 2015, we talked about a north-south impasse in the refugee regime. Northern states wanted to contain refugees in the global south, but they provided the bulk of the funding and resettlement opportunities. And states in the global south, that they were seeking ways to extract as many resources as possible from donor countries. This north-south impasse became sort of a crystallizing factor in the governance of the refugee regime. But by the time we get to 2015 and the New York Declaration, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, and the Global Compact on Refugees, we see that that dichotomy breaks down. Consider East Africa, where you have Kenya on the one hand that pursuing the work on the Sharika Plan, where Ishimwe has been so critical in promoting refugee participation within that policy initiative. And in contrast, its neighbor Tanzania that withdrew from the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework in January of 2018. In fact, when we look at a review, a content analysis of the statements given at UNHCR's Executive Committee meeting in 2025, and here I'd like to thank Hannah Murray, an MA student in the Migration and Diaspora Studies program at Carleton University, for conducting this content analysis, we see a new alignment of states within the refugee regime. While states are increasingly giving restrictive statements, such as those that we saw from the United States and Argentina and others, that 20 states gave very progressive statements. And critically, among those 20 states, 11 from the global north, 9 from the global south, including countries like Colombia and Kenya. So combined with the effectiveness, evidence on the effectiveness of refugee-led organizations and their work, and combined with the principles of the Shifting Power Pledge, what we see is this geopolitical realignment within the refugee regime that creates an opportunity for refugee-led responses, new forms of evidence to engage with those states who remain willing to take progressive stances on the functioning of the refugee regime. And it's in that combination of efforts that together we will be able to face these dark times that are facing the refugee regime. Thank you very much. Liliana, back to you.
Thank you very much, James, for this very informative and insightful intervention. And I think we are already going into a trend between you and Reuven's comment on this working together and thinking about not on the regime, not from a very pessimistic view, but finding opportunities in these very challenging times. Now we'll be learning from Marie Ishimwe from our seat, Refugee Seeking Equal Access at the Table, about the evolving nature of refugee participation, especially in the context of East Africa. Ishimwe, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Liliana. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this very, I think, distinguished panel. It's always sometimes difficult to speak after James or even Reuven in this case, but allow me to start by saying that I'm really thankful to be part of this discussion. Unfortunately, I am not of the view that the situation is good. Of course, all of us see this as that, but the current humanitarian challenges and political challenges should make all of us not sleep. I've been a refugee myself for 20 years. 5 of those years not with an ID. 15 of those years my family didn't have a status. This is a story of many refugees. This is a reality for many refugees in this case. And I think it's important to raise this because we've seen what some of the news that have come of at US, for example, in the last couple of hours about, say, reviewing the resettlement and stuff like that. I think this current moment is deeply troubling for many refugees, those in the camps, those in the settlements. It almost kind of shows that there's a failure in the system. And if we do not become very honest about that, I think we will be doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, and that is not what is beneficial. Ruven, James, and have been able to share the central work that UNHCR does and the critical essence of that. But I put it to you that in the context we are at the moment, I think the humanitarian reset should be looked a little bit deeper. To what level is it very welcoming to refugee participation? And this is what I was asked about. I mean, what's the evolving nature in the refugee participation in East Africa? I've worked in Kenya, I've worked in Uganda, I've worked in the region. We are promoting this, but more and more I see progress, but you see that there's a cautiousness, and you have to ask yourself whether the system is ready for refugees to lead. And I think that's going to be the question, especially when we are talking about these changes. A humanitarian reset will have to mean that refugees have to be central in that process and RLOs. Just the same way at UNHCR, and in the context right now, we are sort of in this anniversary period, the centrality of protection is something that is talked about a lot of the time. But I think to what extent can we also bring about the centrality of refugee participation so that that then informs how decisions, how policies are done. RLOs like many others in Uganda, in Kenya, in many other places are trying to challenge the status quo. But is the environment and is there an enabling environment to that? The answer is that they seem to be will, but a lot of that is still very, very challenging. So is the system ready for refugees to lead? I mean, that's a question that we'll have to grapple with. But I think it is not a situation about who does what and who doesn't do what. It's about collective solidarity. But at the very, very central to it is then refugee participation. At ICT, we always talk about refugee participation not as a goal, but as a means. So how do we see participation bringing about justice? How it brings effectiveness in policy or programs? And so this is where we need to look at when I'm saying that there's a need to think about the centrality of refugee participation. There's more wars, more displacement, increasingly restrictive government policies that are being talked about, with tighter border security, challenging asylum space and stuff like that. I think these are threats that should scare all of us, especially for many, many refugees who are found in the global south, over 70% that will be hard hit in this period. And so it's really a moment to be very, very honest and have that clarity that the system has done, and UNHCR has contributed greatly to the protection of refugees. But to be able to sort out or find the solutions to the challenges we have today, then we have to ask how, in the context of when we talk about a broken system, how do we have a system reset, and then how do we have refugee centering to that? So allow me to then speak squarely about then participation and how it varies in the East Africa region. We've seen since, I think, GRF 2019, when there was just a few refugees at the Global Refugee Forum, and at least I think that time 20 or so, to in 2023 around 323. This is progress. However, I think questions have been raised. To what extent is it just filling spaces, or is it having a meaningful role when in search of this space? And I think this is the question that when I say, is the space ready, then we have to ask the space or the system. Are you an obstructionist? Are you an enabler? And then this is really the question when we're talking about participation. How I see participation in the East Africa region, and this is in the broader perspective of the Great Lake regions and the Horn of Africa. This is one of the regions that has at least 5 million plus refugees, and around, I think, 24 million refugees a forcibly displaced person. And so what we see is that there's two things. I mean, I think this is the same in other regions maybe, but this region is both a host and a producer of refugees. And so there's quite a varying understanding of participation, but also localization and many other aspects to the same. And so we need to look at the progress. My assessment is that there is progress in participation. In principle, there is support to that, but sustaining that has become the challenge, and as I will be sharing in a little bit here. So there's a good political will in the region. Governments in the regions are allowing refugees to register, but there's compounded challenges that are emerging on a vetting and clearance that has now been introduced in some of the countries that might limit how refugees register, especially if you're more critical to certain issues, then you're likely not to be locked up. And so we need to encourage that political will to extend without discrimination of anyone. We also see that, for example, Ethiopia is the new entrant in terms of supporting RLOs. We have 3 RLOs that are now registered in Ethiopia, 3 of them being women-led. And that is also very encouraging for the fact that many of the RLOs in the region and generally are also very man-led. And so just having women and some of these other marginalized groups is very important equally. In terms of RLOs, they see themselves as equal partners. Refugee leaders see themselves as has been alluded already with Ruven and James, as contributors to policy, contributors to programming, and sometimes as equal partners because they are the people that are in the front line, they're in the communities, and they know how the situation is. However, partners and governments sometimes do not share the same view as RLOs or refugees being equal. And so we need to explore that so that this confrontational, where you have governments and refugees and partners disagreeing, especially from a principle of participation, then kind of is removed. We have over 200 RLOs in the region, again, to tell you that there's progress. However, I recently attended an event where I was talking about partnerships for refugees and funding, and only 2 out of 30 RLO leaders could confidently say that they had funding in the next to cater for their next 2 years or 3 years. Only 2 out of 30 RLOs, and you can imagine that in the larger basket of the very limited funding that comes to RLOs. Then, of course, the bigger issue becomes that, and even what we're trying to support in Kenya and in Uganda, that as much as refugee participation is progressive, we have a challenge where refugees are still being brought into policy discussions quite late. And this, again, goes back to that centrality of participation and the foundation to that. And so government partners view participation differently. In some cases, government can see, and partners sometimes see refugee participation as extra work, whereas this is the bedrock of actual effectiveness of policies and programs and so on. And so there's that essentiality that is needed in terms of that process. Give it, for example, in Kenya with the Shirika plan, that then how can government see refugee participation not as just the goal, but a means to creating some of these plans and policies. There's also a high level of securitization for refugees. So refugees are defined sometimes as foreigners, and this can limit their participation, especially when policy and law is attributed. That you see that sometimes, and so you find it is a challenge. For RLOs and refugees, on the other hand, is different. Refugees and RLOs see themselves with the skills, with the expertise, with the solutions, actually working solutions in the community. You can talk about the COVID-19 situation when all partners have left, or some of them not able to work, who are there to support the refugees in the host community, the RLOs, the community-based organization. So we have to look at how can government and how can partners and UNHCR, even in its current changing circumstance and everything, see refugees and RLOs as expertise to support that work. Really, this is important. And so Kenya with Shirika plan, Uganda with the open door policy, Ethiopia with the marketed plan, and many other aspects. I think bringing refugees in some of these policies and plans is important, because refugees see participation as essential. They also see themselves as a future, being able to craft a future that they can thrive and not only survive, because the current system, unfortunately, has brought about aid dependency. And this, you can imagine, it's something that then attacks the mindset and attacks the psychological ability sometimes. And so refugees are changing and redefining that they are actually contributors to policy. Let me then finish by talking to us about some of the recommendations that I see important. First, I've already said that I think it is important that humanitarian reset not only stays at just humanitarian. We need to have a systemic reset, a leadership reset, and I think the next person, the next HC for UNHCR will have, it will be quite a lot of work, because it's not going to be business as usual. We have zero resettlements. We have challenges with funding to responses at the ground level. We have RLOs lacking funding. So it's not going to be business as usual. It's going to be, how can we be consciously seeing how best to move participation, localization, as it's talked about being the future, to actually being practical. This idea of, very nice statements and very nice submissions in spaces like this and many others, whereas we are not honestly speaking about the challenge of the system, I think it's problematic. So a few recommendations, one that are based from some of the work we're doing in the East Africa region as RCIT, but also that is contributed by many other partners. Government must institutionalize refugee participation through advisory and expert mechanism at national and regional levels to connect these efforts to the global refugee ecosystem. And I say this because participation, unfortunately, in this region is taken only for feedback and consultation. I'm not saying this is always the case, but it's largely always around that. And so we need to move to look at refugees, their expertise, how can they contribute to policy and the like. Then I think from a UNHCR perspective, not me as UNHCR, but really an advice to UNHCR or a recommendation is that we need to move away from refugee leadership or refugee participation only at project-based work. We need to see how can refugees who are competent, who have the expertise, be able to rise up in some of those executive positions. They only say that who wears their shoe knows where it pinches them the most. And so it's not about favor, it's about UNHCR being affirmative, that just saying refugee participation is important, refugee participation is central, is not going to be enough. It's going to be, what pathways can this be created so that refugees' professional experience and expertise move beyond just volunteer roles and actually rise up to that. Then my third and second last sort of recommendation is accountability must prioritize refugees. Unfortunately, the system has a tendency to have accountability more to donors vis-a-vis the refugees and the RLOs. This has to be spoken about. And I put it to you that then it's important to fund RLOs, important to fund refugee communities and refugee leaders with not just operation like normal project-based funding, but as we talked in the system, flexible, direct, and quality funding. Then lastly is shifting narratives of refugees as burden. And I think this is also something that we will partly need to look at, because when that is changed from thinking about refugees and displaced people being burden, then it will move us to a discussion where we see refugees with who they are, with their skills, with their abilities, with their aspiration. And just to say thanks, and that's how I see, but it's going to have to be very critical and honest discussion that will move us from just seeing participation as a goal, but participation as a means to effectiveness of the rest of the country.
Thank you so very much, Ishimwe, for this very relevant presentation, both in terms of the progress that has happened, but also in terms of challenges for the centrality and the quality of participation, and for all these suggestions in trying to create accountability to refugees. Before we move to our next speaker, I just want to remind all the participants that you're able to send questions for our question and answer session through the chat. So please, if you have questions, if you want to engage with our speakers, just prepare them and place them on the chat. If you need to do them in Portuguese, Spanish, or French, we are able to translate them to the speakers and allow you to pose your questions. So lastly, but definitely not least, we will hear from Jeff Crisp, who holds affiliations with LERRN, the Refugee Studies Center of University of Oxford, and Chatham House. Jeff will lead us on thinking about the role of academia and shaping the direction of UNHCR's work. Thank you so much, Jeff, for sharing your time and insights with us. Please, you have the floor.
Great to be with you all. My presentation today is titled Waiting for Academia, the Impact of Research on UNHCR Policy, Programs and Practice. In the spring of 1991, I was flying to the Iranian capital of Tehran to undertake a review of UNHCR's response to the Kurdish refugee crisis that had erupted as a result of Saddam Hussein's military assault on northern Iraq. Sitting next to me, sipping a cup of tea, was Dr. Sadako Agata, the Japanese university professor who had recently been appointed as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. In a feeble attempt to break the ice with her, I said, "High Commissioner, now that you've left academia and are leading UNHCR, do you have any thoughts about how you might foster a closer relationship between the two?" She put down her cup of tea, gave me a withering look and said, "Mr. Crisp, I'm currently dealing with one of the largest and most rapid movements of refugees that we've seen in recent years. Academia will have to wait." Now, despite Mrs. Agata's somewhat dismissive response at that moment in time, throughout its 75-year-old history, UNHCR has had some very close connections with the academic world. Many of its staff members have had higher degrees, PhDs, and scholarly publications to their name, especially in the field of refugee law and protection. Paul Weiss, Gilbert Yeager, Guy Goodwin-Gill, Jean-Francois Dourier, and Alex Aleinikoff are just 5 of the names that come to mind in that respect. And my apologies for the fact that they are all men. UNHCR has published a series of Oxford University Press books under the generic title The State of the World's Refugees, which aspire to reach professional academic standards in their quality, and which were supported by the establishment of a multinational academic advisory board. During my own time with UNHCR, I edited the academic journal Refugee Survey Quarterly on behalf of the organization. We also published around 275 editions of a working paper series titled New Issues in Refugee Research. We made our previously confidential evaluation reports available to researchers online, and we also opened up the UNHCR archives to academic researchers. Throughout its 75-year history, numerous academics have been engaged by UNHCR as consultants and advisors. At national level, a number of UNHCR offices have supported the establishment of refugee chairs at local universities and have signed cooperation agreements with refugee studies centres based in academic institutions. In all of these different ways, not to mention the establishment of GAIN, which I will say a little bit more about later, UNHCR and the academic world have interacted with each other on a regular basis, sharing valuable information, insights, and embarking upon joint initiatives. But to what extent does independent research undertaken by individual academics and their institutes have a direct, sustained, and significant impact on UNHCR policy, programs, and practices? On the basis of my experience in this field over the past 40 years, 25 of them with UNHCR, my answer to that question would be not nearly as much impact as people think it has or would like it to have. Now, let me, in the rest of my presentation, try to elaborate on that comment. Independent academic research, I'd like to suggest, does help to shape the intellectual environment in which UNHCR operates. It plays a role in setting the organization's policy agenda and, in a rather general manner, defining its priorities. In that respect, I'd like to give you three particular examples. Barry Stein and Fred Cuny's research on repatriation under conflict in the 1980s and 1990s, the work of authors such as Cindy Horst, Laura Hammond, and Katie Long on refugee mobility and solutions in the 2000s, and most recently, of course, the activities that LERRN and its partners have undertaken on refugee-led organizations. At the same time, I'd like to suggest that it's generally not easy to draw a direct and immediate line that links the work of academics to the policies, programs, and practices of UNHCR. And that linkage is certainly not one that can be quantified or even assessed with any degree of accuracy. So why is it that independent research has a limited impact on UNHCR, and what can be done to strengthen the relationship? On those issues, allow me to make some very broad generalizations and to be quite blunt in my comments. As far as academics are concerned, I often wonder whether they are really as concerned with policy relevant research and real world impact as many of them claim to be. Their primary preoccupation often seems to be in raising research funding, publishing, attending conferences, and advancing their professional careers, with so-called policy relevant research being a means to achieve those entirely legitimate ends. To generalize further, academics tend to contact UNHCR at too late a stage in the research process. They do not always conduct their interviews in a particularly professional manner. They tend to write up their findings in inaccessible academic jargon and spend far too little time and effort in disseminating their work and soliciting feedback from the UNHCR staff members, let alone the refugees with whom they have had contact. In the worst case scenario, and I've experienced this numerous times myself, researchers make premature and unreasonable requests to UNHCR for information, contacts, research permits, and logistical support such as transport and accommodation. And in that respect, I would strongly suggest that courses on refugee research methods include a strong component on ethics and on protocol. As far as UNHCR is concerned, there are also many reasons why the organization is not as receptive to independent academic research as it could or perhaps should be. As Mrs. Ogata's comment to me back in 1991 suggests, senior managers do not always have the time and sometimes lack the inclination to read academic texts. They can be skeptical about the value of research, especially when it's based on very short visits to refugee and displacement situations, when it deals with the issues that UNHCR was already confronting 3 or 4 years earlier, and to be honest, when that research is critical of the organization. In terms of policy formulation and program design, academic research, we have to realize, is one of only many variables, and a relatively minor one too, that have to be taken into account by UNHCR. Of much more significant, in my experience, are issues such as the availability of funding, host and donor state demands, internal and interagency competition. As an institutional priority, I would suggest that UNHCR's engagement with academia declined quite significantly immediately after the departure of High Commissioner Antonio Guterres. For reasons that I've never fully understood, the agency's policy development and evaluation service, which acted as a focal point for independent researchers, was stripped of that function. UNHCR's open access and widely read working paper series was terminated. And as far as I could tell from my new position at the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford, UNHCR made little effort to work closely with research centres, even if it had established cooperation agreements with them. Now, over the past 5 years, an attempt has certainly been made to address this situation, primarily through the establishment of GAIN and the introduction of UNHCR's so-called whole of society approach. But as some of you will know from an article I published back in 2018, I have always had some reservations about GAIN. Wasn't the world of refugee and forced migration studies already highly networked? Was it appropriate for UNHCR to take the lead in establishing and potentially controlling another network, especially one that was directly linked to the outcomes of the Global Compact of Refugees, which some academics considered to be a seriously flawed initiative? To what extent has and will GAIN be able to surmount the many obstacles to cooperation that I've already identified in this presentation? And finally, I'd just like to ask whether academics should be quite so preoccupied with UNHCR as they have been in the past. In my opinion, far too much has been written about the organization, and perhaps it's now time for us to take heed of the advice given by Oliver Bakewell in an article published in 2008, when he emphasized the need to recognize the importance of policy irrelevant research. I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so very much, Jeff. Always very insightful, very perceptive, and I think pushing us to think about difficult questions, but relevant questions, especially in this relationship between UNHCR and academia. Thank you very much. We have a few questions starting to be posted on our chat, so I'm going to start directing them to you. The first one is from Osama Salem. It mentions that it's to James, and it is about the future of the global refugee regime. In a time like this, when the humanitarian system is under constant attack and doubt, and it is going through a reset, and in a time of rise of right-wing governments, and most importantly, in a time when governments get away with genocide, are we witnessing the end of the current global refugee regime? And we will see soon a new form of the regime designed by the same usual suspects. For example, resettlement spaces are shrinking. But what if this was deemed to happen anyway? What if resettlement was a colonial tool for states rather than a humanitarian tool to serve their own interests? If we are witnessing the end of the regime, what needs to happen to safeguard the refugee rights? And then we have a second one. I'm going to do a round, and then I'll give the floor to the speakers, okay? At a time when the global refugee regime is facing one of its most profound crises, from shrinking resources to political backlash against the very principles UNHCR was created to uphold, what messages of change and call to action do each of you carry as leaders in this space? What is the one shift you believe is essential to renewing protection, rebuilding trust, and ensuring that UNHCR mandate remains meaningful for those who most affected by displacement? And this is a question by Maria Guevara. I think these are the two that we have so far. So if you are able to take the lead on that, James, and then we go to Ishimwe and Jeff, and then we see if there are other questions. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And, Jeff, I take on board your points about, the origin stories of GAIN, and maybe in the discussion time we have a chance to come back to that, because I think it raises some really important questions about how relationships between a research community and an organization like UNHCR can be established and sustained, and on what basis. But thank you, my dear friend Osama, for asking such a challenging question, and Maria as well. Maria, who's the new regional lead in Latin America with our seat. So thank you for those questions. I'll start with Osama's and then link that into my reply to Maria's, and then I'm keen to hear Ishimwe and Jeff on these. Osama, to your question about whether we will see the emergence of a new kind of regime. First of all, the simple answer, of course, is I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to come. But I think based on what we have seen before, there's a couple of ways of answering that. I think number one is that within the refugee regime, there's always been diffuse governance, right? So governments who have sought to pursue policies of containment and restriction have always had other venues where they would be able to go to pursue that agenda. So I think the intergovernmental consultations on asylum and migration, for example, has served often as one of those alternate sites. I think what's different this time around is it's not forum shopping. It's not looking into different spaces where key states can get their way. It's this, and this is why this event that we saw on the margins of the UN General Assembly High Level Week, where the United States and in its statement in XCOM in 2025 has actively called for a pulling apart of the regime that has been in place with the norms and institutions that we had in 1950 and 1951. Now, the question is, will that result in a new regime or a further weakening of the current regime? And then that leads to the question of what constitutes a regime, right? For a regime to happen, that there needs to be a certain level of buy-in around the norms and the institutions around a system of collective action is agreed upon. And so, no one actor can create a new regime on their own. And this is why understanding these new geopolitical contours becomes so important. When we see, a very broad spectrum of states continuing to make progressive statements at UNHCR's executive committee, even at a time where those very same governments are trying to maintain productive relationships with those governments that are making restrictive statements, when you see a coalition of governments, and again, my thanks to Hannah Murray for her assessment of these statements, but when you see governments as diverse as Sweden, Colombia, Japan, France, Zambia, Uruguay, South Sudan, Kuwait, Kenya, Australia, and Canada, when you see those governments making progressive statements and sustaining the regime, it gives me hope that there is a coalition that's in place to do that. Now, this goes to Ishimwe's point that we can't just rely on the old way of working, because the old logic of being able to rely on secure funding, that logic is gone. And so for me, the goal is, Ishimwe mentioned the Makatet plan in Ethiopia. In Kenya, the Sharika plan, Colombia's willingness to regularize the status of 1 million Venezuelans, enabling them to provide services as doctors, as teachers, etc. What we need now, and this also goes to Jeff's point, is we need solid evidence on the value of collective action to serve as the basis of continuing that principle in light of the detractors. It's no longer sufficient to say, thou shalt cooperate, thou shalt uphold these principles because you signed on to them 75 years ago. What we need is to have evidence of where and how responses can be effective, can be efficient in this new environment, to be able to have examples to point to say, see, that's why it's worth cooperating. And so this is where the work of refugee-led organizations, refugee participation, research that's conducted by those most affected by displacement, these are the actors that really understand not only the nuanced realities within which we're trying to foster cooperation, but those opportunities for cooperation that we may have otherwise overlooked. So Maria, to your point, what is it that we do now is that we look for those moments where the magic is happening, and we document what it takes for that magic to happen, and we celebrate it, and we endorse it, and we focus our energies there. So, I think Jeff's point about it's not about producing academic research that yes, contributes to the academic debate, but then take the research that we do, translate it into languages, translate it into forms, into podcasts, into social media campaigns, into policy briefs, into infographics, that's going to do what Ishimwe asked us to do, which is contribute to a counter narrative. The narrative that predominates right now is that you're a sucker if you cooperate. That that the states that are strong can pull up their drawbridges and sharpen their swords and keep refugees out and exclude them. So we need to have equally powerful messages about the value of inclusion, the value of participation, the value of cooperation, and the value of collective action. And I think that's possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. Ishimwe or Jeff, if you want to jump in. Otherwise, we have a lot of other questions here at the chat, so we can also move to them. Just let me know.
I do agree with, I think, James, that I think it's a difficult question, Osama. I mean, especially for refugees. I've been in meetings where, like, you feel like there's a darkness of actually how the system works. And I think the aspect that James talked about where do we find the moments to celebrate, I would put a caveat that where do we see the moments of actually having honest conversation? Unfortunately, this is the pretentious angle of the system. We are always saying things, things are okay, things are not okay. But I think we need to go deeply and say, these are the things that are working, these are the things that are not working, and work with the coalition of states that are still progressive to show that this is actually the right way to go. But let me say that I think the aspect of what we're looking at here is that, I mean, for example, in the African continent, most of these countries have been in meetings just this week in IGAD, and they were talking about some of these wars and problems are caused by some of our member states and some of these actors in this space. So how do we do prevention even more as well? So that's one of the aspects we need to look at. How do we do prevention more? But ultimately, I think it's really having a dissection of really how the system is and see how best to work. But I think this is a very big moment to support social movements and do a little bit more in terms of supporting also what I've seen working in Kenya, more litigation and more kind of building on legal premises that can be able to be put and say, you cannot do this because this is it, even if you were to change a certain part of how people have agreed. And I think in terms of the question of Maria, for me, it's what's next is really thinking about the mindset. I think sometimes we need to talk to the hearts of people. It only feels a little bit easier when someone else will face what you face, what someone else has faced. So this lived experience perspective is important, but we need to kind of bring this about and make people to have a mindset shift so that the initiatives and the things that will make people's rights and refugee rights to be respected, continue to be respected, and have more people as champions for the same in the space.
A quick response from me. I definitely think it's true to say that refugee protection standards have declined globally. I definitely think it's true to say that the international refugee regime has been weakened as a result of the geopolitical trends that James very expertly analysed during his presentation. And clearly there is this new threat from the USA and the Trump administration. Now, literally minutes before starting this meeting, I finished an article which is titled, "Can Trump Dismantle the UN Refugee Convention?" And in that article, I point out that I don't think that the people around Trump have fully understood and realized the content of the convention. I think it's been a knee-jerk reaction without really studying the document. I don't think that they've realized the degree of attachment to the convention that other states and organizations, civil society and NGOs have. And I don't think they've fully realized that whether Trump likes it or not, refugees are going to move. They're going to seek sanctuary in other states, and something will have to be done to provide them with protection, assistance, and ultimately solutions. So my prediction, I don't know what other people think about this, my prediction in the article is I think that the Trump administration is going to find it much more difficult to replace the convention with a new convention than it appears to think it is. I think it's much more likely that in typical Trump fashion, we're likely to see a unilateral US withdrawal from the convention while other states remain attached to it. But we'll have to wait and see whether that is actually what happens in practice.
Thank you for the three of you. I'm going to pose two questions that ask for recommendations and suggestions and projections for the future. And if you have time, you go to others. But if not, I'm going to ask the speakers to have a look at the question and answers. But I think you can also gather them and send them to each of the speakers so everybody can get a reply or at least have their questions read. So 2 questions that are asking for your expertise and insight. You noted that the current geopolitical shifts are not entirely new for the refugee regime and that UNHCR has had to adapt to similar moments in the past. Based on that historical experience, what priorities would you recommend to the new High Commissioner for Refugees to ensure that UNHCR can navigate geopolitical shifts more effectively and preserve protection space and solutions for refugees? There's a question from José Sieber. And there is another one thinking about, if you look ahead, if we imagine the refugee system in 2040, what does a truly participatory and equitable model look like? And what steps must begin now to shift UNHCR from a guardian for refugees to a guardian that works alongside refugee-led institutions as equal actors? And this is a question by Najiba Wazefost.
I really want to hear Ishimwe and Jeff's views on this. So maybe I'll keep it. I'll keep my answer. Whenever a speaker says I'll keep my answer short, you know that they're about to launch into something very, very long. But Najiba, a really critically important question, and thank you for posing it. I think it's really difficult. I think it's difficult to know what the world is going to look like in 2040. Right. So, there isn't a firm marker that we're working towards, but I think it's, how does UNHCR need to imagine its role in responding to the kind of challenges that we see now and the kind of challenges that we see coming up? And I think, there was a mantra for a while about, the importance of UNHCR recognizing that UNHCR can do more by doing less. And I think that this is something that we saw during the COVID pandemic, and Najiba, you were deeply involved in documenting that response as many were, that at a moment where the humanitarian system was put on pause, where international actors were told to shelter in place. It was in that moment that most clearly we saw the role of refugee-led organizations not stepping in to meet new needs, but in that moment where the noise and the visibility of international actors was muted, that we saw what refugee-led organizations have always been doing. And so I think out of this moment, and I echo Jeff's point on this, that we recognize how fickle big power politics has always been and will continue to be. I think that there are 3 things that I would say that answer to both questions. Number one, that increasingly we're entering a period that I think will endure for some time, where the value of norms on their own will not be sufficient to influence the action of powerful actors. That powerful actors increasingly are seeing that they are able to pursue interests and their own priorities through other forms of power. So not productive power, not institutional power, but of coercive power and material power. So I think recognizing that, it's to be able to, number one, make the substantive case for the value of cooperation. So relying more on celebrating and rewarding those actors where cooperation is achieved is one. Number two, recognizing the value that an international organization like UNHCR can't do it all on its own. So to take this language of partnership and to translate that into a new way of working within the organization, to not say what the organization needs to do is to keep as many elements of its programming in place so that when the funding comes back, it can grow back into the role that it occupied in December 2024. So there needs to be a recognition that there are some things that UNHCR must do there are certain things that are exclusively UNHCR's mandate, and to look for cooperation with refugee-led organizations, with local NGOs, with the principle of localization on where and how other activities can be delivered in a more, not only efficient way, but in a way that is seen as more legitimate by a local population. I think that's one. And then, so one, documenting where cooperation works. Number two, taking the question of partnership seriously. But number three, and I think is most critical, is to recognize that, shifting the interests of the most powerful actors in the world, as we see in the UN Security Council, the UN Security Council has been paralyzed because of the veto powers of the permanent 5 members, and reforming the peace and security architecture of the United Nations has proven to be incredibly challenging. So the advantage for UNHCR is to be able to say that there is a majority of states in the world that do want to cooperate. And so working with the majority and realizing what's possible through partnership and through the substantive case for cooperation, that's where I think the solution is to be found. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. Jeff?
Yeah, sure. If you ask me to come up with one word to describe the history of UNHCR over the past 75 years, I would use the one word expansion. Over the last 75 years, UNHCR has expanded geographically. It's expanded in terms of the number of staff, the size of its budget. As Reuven explained, it's expanded in terms of the groups of people that it works with beyond refugees. It's also expanded in terms of the range of functions and activities that it undertakes. And to be very honest, when I was working for UNHCR, I was quite supportive of UNHCR's expansion and its expansive kind of tendencies. I must say, since leaving the organization, and particularly with, of course, the new financial crisis, I've become increasingly wary about its expansiveness and wonder whether UNHCR should actually begin to contract or at least prioritize a little bit more carefully. I think what's happened to UNHCR is it's moved in the direction of becoming an all-purpose aid agency rather than a refugee protection agency. At exactly the same time, IOM has moved from being a migration management organization to another all-purpose aid agency. And to be very honest, looking at the output of the two organizations on social media, it's extremely difficult these days to tell what the difference is between IOM and UNHCR. And not surprisingly, in the Secretary General's reform process called UN80, the idea has emerged of actually merging UNHCR and IOM together. And as one of my former UNHCR colleagues pointed out recently, he was looking at social media and he saw that both UNHCR and IOM were appealing for funds to assist Afghan earthquake victims. And he made the point that these people were not refugees and they were not migrants. And yet UNHCR and IOM were competing for funds for them. So I think this is an appropriate moment for UNHCR to consider the range of activities it's involved in, to see whether it should prioritize more clearly and retract to being more of a refugee protection agency than it's become. Now, as James has said, the real problem with that is the whole question of earmarking of funding. In a rational world, I would suggest UNHCR perhaps should not have got tremendously involved in the Ukrainian refugee situation, given that Ukrainian refugees went to some of the most prosperous countries in the world. But given that donor states have the ability to earmark their funding to UNHCR, UNHCR does not have a great deal of choice as to where it prioritizes its activities. So I think it will be a good time for UNHCR to look more closely at the range of activities it's involved in. But whether it can do that in a really rational manner because of the earmarking of funding, I think is going to be a very difficult challenge.
Yeah. Thank you so much,
Lilian,
Jeff. Ishimwe?
Yeah, I can add just a few points
Please.
without trying to not bear the risk of repeating. One thing I think is that I think someone said that if you're doing everything, then you will end up doing nothing. And this has become what we see with UNHCR for that. I think it has become a development partner, become a peace partner, and all those things. I think there's a need to really refocus the energy on protection. And I say this because the fact that you see that states start to either become more restrictive it speaks about the level of protection and the level of protection for refugees that's going to be impacted. And I think UNHCR needs to go squarely to that. I mean, see where the places that it can be a catalytic organization, where can it be a facilitator organization, and where can it lead? And I think where it can best lead is on protection advocacy. I have a challenge with the way it's done. Unfortunately, it's very soft advocacy that almost looks like you're, without, for lack of a better word, complicit to some of the injustices that happen and some of the problems that happen to refugees. So I think that's going to be an introspection that has to happen. As I think Jeff mentioned, sometimes at the leadership level, some of these things are hard to understand because they are out of touch with the communities. And I think this is where we're going to have to put a lot more effort. What is it that UNHCR can do that is catalytic, facilitative, and leading? And I think the protection work is where it can do more. On the question of saying 2020, I think my assessment is that, as I've said in my presentation, that I don't think the space is still ready for refugees to lead. I think the amount of either competition or control that we see for resources is not encouraging for that to happen. It's really encouraging more competition vis-a-vis collaborative. I think there's going to be a progress. I think there's going to be more RLOs being more integral and supportive in country or host communities. But this will be a little bit conflicted because there's a challenge of funding, and RLOs often don't have that room of flexible funding that they can, they can stay there for a long time, but not for too long if there's no funding. Just that is not to say that they do not stay there, but I think we're going to have to see a paradigm shift of how things are done at Tunisia. I think in the current ecosystem, it's very reactive, and that is not helpful for the proactiveness of really the centrality, as I've been talking about, the centrality of RLO's refugees. This is not prioritized. And so I think from RLO perspective, they feel that they are equitable partners, but is that the same from UNHCR and government? I think it's not the same. So maybe we will be somewhere halfway, but I think it's going to be challenging, that we need a lot of advocacy to reach to a place where we can say that things are a bit different. But my point would be that for RLOs to continue pushing, this is what we see in Kenya, that it works best. If you keep on pushing, it's going to be difficult to be ignored, and that's the revolution that's needed.
Thank you so much, Ishimwe. We have 2 more sets of questions. We also have lots of other questions, but I think we are only able to do 2 more rounds because we have 6 minutes left. And I apologize to the participants, but I'm going to edit a little bit so that we have time to go through them. So the first round is on funding. There is a question saying that we are seeing a new model from UNHCR funding that is more closely associated with IOM, like a project-based funding. And they are wondering how might these affect UNHCR work. And then there is also a question about whether the MDB's commitments from the GRF 2023 will be able to make a difference in the face of a massive funding shortages. And then we have a second round on academia. And I think it's very interesting considering that this is a webinar led by Gain and Learn. So one question, thinking about the lack of comments or representation of non-Western academia, talking about the issue that the rest of the world outside Western Europe and America are invisible to UNHCR and Western governments. So how can we change that? How can we improve that? But also a question regarding refugee participation and the importance of recognition that knowledge production must be grounded in lived experience. So how can we make this a structural change in forced migration policy, in design and evaluation? As I mentioned, we only have 5 minutes, so if you can pick and choose what you're able to address. And as I mentioned, I'm compiling all the questions and we'll be sharing them with you later. So if it's okay with you, I think I would propose to go James, Jeff, and then Ishimwe to end us in our dialogue today. James?
Okay, all really good questions, and thank you everyone for those. So on the funding question, I'll encourage everyone to keep an eye out for a new report from ODI, the new research on funding to refugee-led organizations. And I think the question is not so much what UNHCR funds or UNHCR subgrants, but where the resources that we currently have available, not just funding from governments, but funding from private actors and all the different sources of funding that we have, how it is that we recognize where that funding can best be allocated. I think, as Ishimwe said, you know, UNHCR has functions that really only UNHCR can perform around protection. But there are other service delivery functions at a time in scarce resources. I think to recognize comparative advantage of different actors, and paramount among those are refugee-led organizations, and to consider the value of direct funding to refugee-led organizations in a way that's complementary to the funding to UNHCR, for example. But let me concentrate on the questions around academia, about embedding meaningful participation of those most affected by displacement, being refugees and non-Western perspectives. Let me say, you know, that I recognize from a perspective of profound privilege that I have as a tenured academic in a Canadian university, that my own experience as a researcher, and this is a moment perhaps of evangelism for all of the academics that are on the call, there has been a reinvigoration in my hope in what academic research can achieve when I've recognized that I am more useful as a researcher when I'm not in the driver's seat. That I'm able to make a better contribution as a researcher when I work in partnership with groups like RSEAT, when I work with groups like the Dadaab Response Association in Dadaab, refugee-led organizations in East Africa, and to recognize that those who are best positioned to identify the questions that need to be asked are those that live the reality every day, not someone who's sitting in the basement of their home on unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa. It recognizes there's a complementary role that academics can play, and that role, that potential, is most unleashed when it's done in true partnership from the moment of setting the research question. So Jeff, to your point about contacting UNHCR and saying, this is the research that I'm doing, I need access to this population to do my research, what informs the question that you ask needs to be derived from opportunities for partnership. That's becoming easier and easier and easier to do, given a platform like this, that we're sitting in different countries in different regions of the world and we're having a conversation. So do that. Likewise, the substantive value of work, for example, of the IDRC research chairs. I think one of the most meaningful experiences that we've had is when a research chair from Peru and a research chair from Morocco, Matthew Bird and Miriam Cherthi, were engaged in presenting their research on their perspectives on UNHCR's route-based approach to protection, and saying, from the perspective of the evidence that we have in our region, in our context, this is how we engage with this policy paradigm. It really is that grounded experience that is able to bring perspective that speaks directly to the policy and program challenges that we face every day. So there's a complementary role for everyone to make. And as my mother always taught me, I have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. I should listen twice as much as I speak. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. We are at the time that we're supposed to end, but I want to hear from Jeff and Ishimwe, so I'm going to give them their floor and ask for their short comments to finalize our event. Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. I was in a meeting with James a few years ago, and James made the point that 80% of the world's refugees are in the global south, and 80% of the knowledge production about refugees comes from the global north. And I thought that was a very accurate and astute comment at the time. I don't think it's changed significantly in the past few years, but I think there is the potential for change. Definitely, refugee-led research is gaining visibility, perhaps gaining some funding and gaining prominence. We've got LERRN itself. We've got the new refugee-led research hub here in Oxford, which is very much rooted in the global south, despite having its administrative centre in Oxford. So I think there is a great deal of potential for change. I would say that I don't think it's going to be immediate. I think it's going to take quite a long time for the northern dominance to break down. I'd also make the point that even within the global north, academic funding and funding for research goes to a very small and limited number of different individuals and organizations, even within the global north. And we really need to kind of democratize the whole notion of academic funding for research on refugees. Hopefully that will happen in the years to come, but I don't think it's going to be an early or immediate change. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Ishimwe?
So, thank you, Liliana. I'll say a few points. Relating to the question, I saw some questions for RCT and some of our work. So 2 points. I was talking to some refugees in a certain meeting, and they were saying, if this system is currently is currently almost shutting down, let it shut down, because it's not been effective to us. And that is the level of frustration that refugees are having. And this will continue to be, especially when refugees are not centered to decisions and policy and all these things. And the triple effect to that is that there's going to be more protest for some of even very good programming that will come, because that will not be inclusive to refugees in terms of the engagement in that process. And so I think that is something that UNHCR should be aware of, that there's going to be more protest, more kind of this push if communities are not very much engaged. And then number 2 is that the work of RCT in the region as supporting governments is really to kind of redefine how the governments in the global south work. As I've mentioned in some of my submissions, that a lot of the participation question here are looked at as feedback and consultation. Not to say this is bad, but I think there's a level of engagement that needs to happen for expertise engagement to be part of this. I don't think it's right to have refugees come and tell the story and then leave the space for someone else, Jean-Marie or someone else who has the expertise to do that. It has to be a combination of those two. And so RCT is doing a lot of convening for governments in the region, supporting engagements to really domesticate how to get to that level of engagement. And that level of collectiveness is what we need. Number 2 is how we can be as a tool. So we might not necessarily work directly in a certain country, but we're able, for example, in the southern region, Africa, to see how can we provide some of our training, some of our expertise, some of our experience in that process. And so I think that is going to be part of it. But lastly to say is that I think for all of us, I think participation in principle is being supported. Unfortunately, this is performance. It's really performative. I hate to say this because maybe it's been said many times, but this is really the case, that the refugee meaningful participation that currently exists at the moment, that is pushed by RLOs and refugees themselves, is very, very meaningful. But the one that is coming from governments and partners is unfortunately not meaningful. And this is where we need to argue a little bit more. So there's going to be a need for more collectiveness, but also saying things that are not working and working on those things in a collective way. So just to say that, and Lilian and everyone, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ishimwe. And in fact, I'm going to start giving thanks for everyone involved in this seminar. So thank you to our speakers, Ruven, Jeff, James, Ishimwe. It was a pleasure to hear from you, to learn from you, to share your insights. I'm sure you gave us a lot of food for thought in thinking about the refugee regime in this 75th anniversary of UNHCR. Not only the regime, but also UNHCR itself. So I think it was really relevant to hear from all of you. I want to thank the LERRN team that made all of this possible. As James mentioned, with these technologies, we are much closer and we can work together and we can collaborate and try to bring down some paradigms and shift how we create knowledge and how we share knowledge and debate and create this new refugee regime that we are all looking forward to. And also thanks to the audience members that have been here with us and have endured this 5-minute delay in our ending time. But I'm sure that you all appreciate all the talks and sharing of knowledge. So thank you very much. And we look forward to having you on our next GAIN webinar. Thank you so much.